And before I start, I'm so thrilled that you all come out online tonight to see this. We really do want to make sure that as master gardeners, we find a way to get to people and communicate and help you grow things this summer. So there'll be more and more things where master gardeners are available online teaching, and I hope you take advantage of it. So to just at the 50,000 foot level, we're in the citrus genus of the Citriae tribe of the Rudiaceae family. The citrus family basically comes from a single genetic source in Southeast Asia. And you find the first examples of it used in world trade. They found citron in the Middle East dated 500 BCE. And they found one of the oldest lemon seeds found in Rome somewhere between 100 BCE and 100 CE. So this crop has been a cash crop for export and trade for several thousand years. And it basically moved up and down the spice route from Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean. It got to California in 1769. It was planted at the Mission San Diego. And the first commercial groves in LA started in 1841. The first Northern California commercial grove was 1856. And California is approximately 59% of the US citrus production. What I call your attention to is this map on the right. What you'll notice is that the prime agricultural land for growing citrus is to the south of us. Now, that's what it is today. As climate changes, we should be in a position to grow larger citrus and more varieties as the climate around us warms up. But today, the optimal place is south of here. We're sort of at the hairy edge of where citrus grows well in America. So in the basics, it's a perennial. It's an evergreen. It's a subtropical plant, so it wants 6 hours of sunlight in February. The truth is it requires as much sunlight as possible, and it requires heat to produce sugar. And it can have single or multiple blooms a year, depending upon the type of citrus. And it has this characteristic called alternate bearing. So you could have a heavy crop one year and a light crop the next. And it's sort of the tree processing fertility, a heavy year and then a lean year. And so you shouldn't panic if you have a year where there aren't as many fruit as the previous year. That's normal. Most citrus fruit is edible within 8 to 16 months of blooming and has a 2 to 6 month season for harvest. The truth is the fruit stores best on the tree. So the moment you pick the fruit, citrus ethylene starts and the decay of the fruit starts. There's another interesting thing about citrus trees. They do something called June drop, which is not a dance, I guess. It's the tree will push out more blossoms than it will take to fruit, and then it will push out more immature fruit than it will take to mature. So it basically drops a bunch of fruit in May, June, early July, as it's editing what fruit it wants to take to fruition. And this is basically a way of the tree itself is pruning its own harvest. So if you suddenly have fruit dropping off the tree in May, June, that's normal. The interesting thing about citrus trees is their root system is fairly close to the surface of the soil, and it tends to go out 2 times the width of the drip line. So if you had a tree that the diameter was 16 feet across, 8 feet from the trunk all the way around, the root system of a mature tree could be out 24 feet. So it's one of the things to pay attention to when you're thinking about where to plant one of these trees is how do I have the most space for the root system? And how do I not do things that will later require me to cut through that soil? Because most of the roots are in the top 12 to 24 inches. Now, the leaves do two things. They process sunlight and they store sugar. And photosynthate is important to the tree. And if flowers form in the winter and then are shed as you grow to maturity, again, it produces more flowers than fruit and more immature fruit than final fruit, and that's normal for a citrus tree. And you can, when you first plant a tree, you could have 3 to 4 years with very light production. And that's because the tree is putting most of its energy into a root growth and tree limb structures. Now, on bearing trees, usually you're flowering in the spring, you'll have a growth flush, but the spring is the most productive, and the tree is optimized at 70 to 90 degree weather. So like the weather this week was a little bit hot for citrus trees when it was over 90.
Joe, we have a question.
Sure.
What is the best type and positioning of drip irrigation? Or are you going to get that later?
We're going to get to that. It's coming, but hold that thought.
Will you be talking about growing in containers as well?
Yes, that's coming as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
I knew I should leave the agenda slide in. I apologize. I took it out because I was trying to tighten up the deck. So if you look at the year, just so you can get your head wrapped around, in the winter, December, well, we're in spring. Actually, we're at the tail end of spring. So you should be fertilizing, pruning. There's a growth flush right now, and you want to make sure your irrigation is on. As you go into summer, you're going to be fertilizing still and pruning. There'll be the June drop, and then you'll turn up your irrigation as it gets hotter and drier. Your harvest starts in the fall. You'll turn down or off your irrigation. And this is also the time when you plant new trees, October to March. And then in the winter, also time to plant new trees. That's when you worry about frost protection. And usually it's your harvest season, except for lemons and limes that can be year-round bearing. So this is, if you're trying to think sort of at the big picture, what should I be worrying about by sort of time of year? These are the big categories of things to be doing. I put this together because I couldn't find it anywhere as a discrete thing from any of the citrus sites. So there you go. So the variety of citrus is truly astonishing, and the number of types that we can grow here is amazing. But before we talk about the varieties, let me point out probably the problem that most people run into, which is you've bought a house that's been here for 30, 50 or longer years. It has citrus trees, and they're really big for the property, really big in the space they're in, or too tall and you can't get to the majority of the fruit. What this means is that when the tree was planted, it was probably a standard size orchard tree on the order of 30 feet in height is the eventual height. When I talk to people, most of us want to have citrus trees in the 8 foot to 10 foot, 12 on the outside. The more you have to be in a ladder to harvest something, the less likely you will do that, and it's not very safe. So if you're trying to think through buying a citrus tree, there's a whole set of things to think about. But the most basic is, are you buying a dwarf or a semi-dwarf or a standard? This chart, which will get a printout version that you can use, is a list of all the varieties and then the scion varieties of citrus that do well in Marin County and Northern California in general. So you have blood oranges and sour oranges and grapefruit and mandarins. It gives you a sense of the height, whether they're cool climate, whether you can buy dwarves in this variety, and which ones are good in containers and espalier. The reason I bring this up is, and here's kumquat and limequat and orangequat and pomelos and citron. is some of you are container gardeners, and not all citrus trees do well in containers. So, and some of us live in cooler climates like Mill Valley or along the coast or in West Marin. So this is of that whole list of varieties that do well, and that list came from the Marin Master Gardener Handbook, Four Winds Growers, and Monrovia Nursery. Out of all those varieties, if you're in one of the cooler parts of the county, which is characterized by closer to the ocean or this bay, then you might want to look at this reduced list of varieties. If you're in the hot part of the county, you can pretty much grow everything. But if you're also then wondering about containers, you want to be buying the shorter, smaller varieties that will go well in a container. So this list gives you that group, containers and dwarfs. And the reason I say this is you don't want to spend all your time fighting with a tree. And the more you've tied the selection of the tree to the size of the container, the better off you'll be. So before we move on, any questions?
Yes. So we have a specific question about a container. One participant asks, I have a lemon tree in a metal pot and the taproot is out into the ground. It is really long, growing horizontal. Can I gently dig up the taproot and pull the tree out, or will the tree die?
I assume the taproot came out through the drain hole. I think it's going to be very difficult. I would try, because it's in fact probably not a taproot, but it is a major root. But the question is, are you digging it out to put it in the ground or digging it out to put it in another container?
Okay. And then we have questions about water and fertilizer, but I think we'll be getting to
They're
those
coming
later.
up.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So selecting a citrus tree. I went to a whole bunch of nurseries last year looking at what was stocked. And quite often, truthfully, you want the smaller, younger, non-fruit bearing are the easiest to transplant and the most resilient transplant candidate. The larger the tree is in the nursery, or if it already has fruit, the more problematic transplanting can be. When you look at a tree, it needs to look healthy, so the foliage is strong green color. There are no blemishes or nicks on the bark. You don't want to see any sort of strange branching. I've seen a lot that look just like a stick that's been lopped off, which is a bit odd. And you want to look for any pest damage. Look the container on its side. You want to see if it's root bound. So if you're seeing roots growing out the bottom, in all likelihood, it's been in that container a long time, which is not a good sign. So the three things are you're looking for the variety of fruit that you like in the size that will fit your location in your yard or your container, and a specimen that's healthy for transplant. Because the way to think about this is citrus grow for 50 to 100 years. So the tree you're planting long after we've shuffled off this mortal coil will still be there and people will be enjoying it. So plant selection, variety selection, and whether it's a dwarf, semi-dwarf, or standard are critical to having a situation that you're going to enjoy for as long as you live where you live and whoever comes after you.
I have a couple questions about containers again,
Sure.
when you're selecting citrus trees. One is when you say small container when purchasing, is that 5-gallon, 15-gallon, or different quantity?
Um, I'll just get to it quickly.
Oh, okay.
So the truth is, the bigger the container, the better. So 15 to 25-gallon pot is great. You want the top of the pot to be larger than the bottom, because if you get one of those Greek design pots where it's narrow at the top, you'll never get the tree out and you won't be able to replenish the soil very well. And you want to make sure that the pot has a drain hole, because you don't want the tree to sit in wet soil.
So the container that it comes in when you purchase it should be 15 gallons as well?
No, no, no. The container you're going to put it in should be 15 to 25. Frankly, the container you purchase it in, 5-gallon or less is great.
Okay,
1 to
great.
5.
And if someone's already established some of the non-container trees in containers and is not planting them in the ground, are they okay? Are they going to have some trouble there?
Well, I mean, it's amazing. People can get things to grow. So I'm not saying it won't work. It's that you're going to have more issues with pruning. You might end up with a really root-bound tree, so you might more frequently have to prune the roots. But if you have a large enough container, I mean, I have seen people with 25 and 50-gallon containers, and when you hit 50, you're pretty much done. That's almost like being in the ground. So if you have a really large container, then you're sort of independent of the container constraints. Did that make sense?
I think so. And the follow-up to that was, can you technically bonsai them if they're small enough, I suppose?
I have no idea.
I know bonsai is like its own field of gardening.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sorry.
Another training. We'll have a bonsai session.
There you go. There's somebody else, because I truly don't have a clue. So any other questions?
But so a variety that would usually get larger if kept in a smaller pot might stay smaller.
No, it might have problems. I mean,
Okay. It's not a one-to-one. Then yes, I think that we're good for now. Thank you.
okay. So the trick is, citrus are very heavy feeders. So you need well-drained soil. Loam and sandy loam soils are best. If you have heavy, dense clay soil, you want to loosen that up and put compost and layer it so that the soil has air in it. The trees are more likely to tolerate sandy soils than heavy clay, but that also then means you're going to be adding more nutrients because there won't be anything in the soil. You want to make sure that you've got weeds and grasses and ornamental plants outside the drip line, not all the way up to the trunk of the tree. And we recommend that you add compost organic material at least annually around the tree to the drip line to feed the tree. And that what that means is go 2 inches out from the trunk of the tree and add 2 inches of compost out to the drip line, and then water heavily. So the way to look at this is you're growing your soil to grow the tree. And so you're always in this process of trying to replenish the soil so that it can feed the tree. And that's sort of the equation you're working with.
Okay.
Soil questions?
One question about why no trees in that tree drip line, but I assume it's part of what you were saying about you're trying to maintain the integrity of the soil for the lemon tree.
I'm sorry, what was the question? I'm sorry.
The question was why you have to be so careful about whether weeds are in the tree.
The thing with weeds is they're taking away nutrients. So when we get to the weeding slide, there's a significant reduction in nutrients to the tree if you have weeds or ornamentals, or worse yet, a lawn right up to the trunk of the tree, whatever's on the surface is getting a disproportionate percentage of the nutrients. So and it's getting a lot of the water. So you want the water and nutrients in the tree, not in the weeds or the soil or the grass.
Okay. And then we have a question about, I think you might cover this in another part, about living in a windy area, like the folks who live on the docks here. If there's an issue with that, or if they hold up fairly well.
It's interesting to me. It depends on if it's a dry wind or a cold wind. The cool climate trees are pretty tough and resilient, but there are citrus that show windburn. So I try to get people to think about it in terms of, can you use a windscreen so that the tree is also getting reflected heat? Because it's not as bad as some other plants, but ideally you wouldn't have a citrus tree with a lot of cold wind, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does get pretty chilly down there at times.
Yeah. So when to plant? Basically October to March, where you need full sun and heat. So if you have sunlight at solstice in December of 6 hours or more, that's a good location. You need good drainage. And if you're planting in a lawn, on the day you plant, remove a 5-foot radius of sod, put in the new tree, and then keep track of it so that as the branching extends, you should assume that the root system's extending, and eventually you're going to want to have the whole area under the limbs clear of sod. Now, if you're growing in a orchard, you could have mature trees with a canopy of 18 to 30 feet. And so that means you're spacing them between 9 and 15 feet apart. You can get commercial groves where you see the trees are incredibly folded into each other. You can also then look at dwarf trees, doing rows of dwarf trees to create hedges or espaliered walls. So if you're thinking of growing multiple trees, you really do need to sit down and plan it out, because you're going to have to plan out all the accompanying things. Is there enough space? Is there enough water? Will it drain correctly? All those things. But by the way, before we leave planting, the spacing issue, I see it all the time. Trees are too close to houses. So for fire smart Marin standards, you shouldn't have a tree within 5 feet of the house itself. And you should be thinking really that the branching system should be further out. So you'll want to put trees, if you're planting a new tree, you don't want to put a new tree close to a house or a structure. It's not safe. So root flare. When you look at a tree, and this is, I'm sorry, this is not the world's greatest photo. A citrus tree has where the trunk of the tree goes into the ground and the root system starts. And if you were a carpenter, I would say you want that to sit proud, slightly above what will be the level of the soil around it. You don't want to bury the root flare, and you don't want to have soil up against the trunk all the way. So if you look at this picture, when we were kids and we were told how to plant a tree, you dug a hole twice as deep as the root ball and twice as wide, and then you'd fill it with peat moss and stuff. What would happen is, as the compost and peat moss broke down, the tree would sink in the hole, and that would cause later problems. So the trick to this is, you don't want to dig a hole deeper than about 3 inches to 2 inches shorter than the height of the root ball. And then you want to set the tree so it's sitting on solid ground. And then you're going to fill in the amended soil around it. And this is very important. If the tree is buried too deep, it won't grow correctly, and eventually it will become diseased. So you want to make sure you've planted the tree so it's sitting proud and it's in a shallow dish, but the dish is wide. So this shows that the dish is 3 times the root ball's diameter. And the reason for that is you're trying to promote root growth. Any question on this planting thing? This is really actually a very big deal.
The only other new question we have kind of relates to what you were talking to before, but it is root related. How do you know where the drip line is specifically?
It's the edge of the tree's branching system.
Okay.
Now, the other side of that is if you're pruning the tree back, you should know that the root system goes out 2x beyond it. And you should try and have in your head an idea of how big this tree would be if you hadn't been pruning it. But I would assume most of us can kind of look at something and say, I think this tree has a 6-foot diameter, my root system goes out another 6 feet. Any other questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay. So staking. How many of you, when you walk around the neighborhood, see trees that were planted 3, 4, 5 years ago and they still have their stakes attached? The trick here is plant the tree, stake it for the first 6 to 12 months, but then get the stakes out. You don't want a tree permanently requiring staking if you can avoid it. If you notice here, they place the root ball and the stakes are outside of it. I've also seen people where they've driven the stake in very close to the trunk of the new tree, which means they've driven it through the root ball, which is not a great idea for 2 reasons. 1, you're damaging the roots, but 2, that's not terrifically stable. That means that the thing itself and the wind, the whole thing could move on you, and you want to avoid that. So watering. If you know that your root system is in the first 2 to 4 feet, and you know that the root system could be twice out the distance of the drip line, the trick when you first plant a tree is you're going to put a coil around it, maybe 1 to 2 feet out from the trunk. But as the tree grows, you want to keep moving your drip line out, your irrigation line, because the roots are out there and you want to promote root growth. So first off, if the tree is already established, a rule of thumb for me is 3 to 5 feet out, I put the irrigation line. It's going to require up to 10 gallons a month. It's going to need watering twice a month or more, depending upon the time of year. And so because these trees are heavy feeders and they're year-round perennials, evergreens, it is a big water commitment to plant citrus trees. Doesn't mean don't do it, just means understand what you're getting into. Now, feeding. 2 inches of compost a year will build the soil, but you should use a citrus fertilizer in addition, a 6:4:6 ratio, because it will have this whole list of minor nutrients that the tree needs. And when we get to the IPM section of the presentation, you'll see that there are all these things that can look like problems with the tree, and it's because it's missing minor nutrients. And you have to assume in Marin County, we have terrible soil, that there's virtually nothing in the soil. I mean, if the tree could get nutrients from rocks and clay, it would be fine, but it really can't. So I fertilize and plant or use citrus or compost annually, and make sure that all of that is spread from around 2 to 3 inches from the base out to the drip line.
Joe, does that is that annual compost, should it be at a certain time of year?
I tend to do it, frankly, in the fall, because before the rains, because then the rains help the nutrients get into the soil. But if you just bought a house or you just got a tree, you could do it now. It's just you're going to start to create a rhythm of annual building of the soil. And I have had trees that I did it twice a year at the beginning because the soil was really bad. So it's interesting, here in Marin, most of our soil is called serpentine. It's clay and rock. And you'll be amazed at how much just 2 inches of compost once to twice a year, spring, after the bloom, and then at the beginning of winter, how much your tree will just inhale that stuff. I mean, it's amazing. Other questions?
Is there a specific type of organic material? I would assume that's part of the compost. And do you have a favorite brand of citrus fertilizer?
I really don't. I use organic compost, and there are lots of places to get good compost.
Okay, then I think we're good for now. Thank you.
So as I said earlier, since these trees want a lot of water, you want to mulch around them and keep the mulch 2 inches away from the trunk and about 2 inches thick. If you are in a drier, hotter part of the county, you might want thicker mulch, because what you're trying to do is suppress weeds and retain liquids. On the weeding side, keeping the weeds out from within the drip line increases growth by 30%. And you want to make sure at a minimum you don't have any weeds within 3 feet of the trunk, and be careful how you're pulling the weeds, so that if you're using one of those tools that you stick in the ground to get all of the weed root system, just be careful that you're not bashing the roots of the tree when you're doing it. Now, mature trees, in all honesty, I know people who are still hand watering starts, younger trees, but eventually with a mature tree, you're going to want an irrigation line around it. You want to make sure that the root system never dries out. So you're pretty much, except for when we have rainy winters, the problem with trees right now is we can have a month of drought in the middle of the winter. And so I make sure that my irrigation is working. I might shut it off for a while in the winter, but I leave it on all summer, and then keep an eye on the tree. So if they're looking like they're starting to dry out, you can add more water. Now, when you're planting a young tree, one of the things to do is create what's called a basin. So you planted the tree and you create a dirt wall around it, maybe 4 inches high, 2 feet out, 3 feet out from the trunk, and then just fill that little basin with water and let it slowly sink in. It's a form of deep watering. So if you're hand watering, that's a way to do that. Otherwise, just use a drip irrigation. Young trees need more frequent watering. Older trees need deeper watering. That's the trade-off on frequency. And in the hottest part of the summer, you're probably on a once a week or once every 5 day schedule. And it's 2 to 5 gallons per tree per watering session. And I know this sounds dodgy. You want to water, but you want to make sure you don't let the soil become soggy. So lower speed watering is good. I know this sounds like a crazy metric, but for a mature tree, in terms of fertilizing, they need about 1 pound of nitrogen a year. So look at your fertilizer mix and look to see what the ratios are, and that will tell you pretty much how much of that fertilizer you need to add a year. Then you get to all the trace elements, and frankly, I just make sure that I have a good citrus fertilizer mix and put it on in the fall to make sure that the plant is going to get enough food. So here's probably the topic that draws the most questions. So this is not a pruning class. I don't like to explain to you the principles of pruning, but the reality is it's really easy to screw up a citrus tree, that being a technical term. So, for example, the picture in the middle is something that got really badly hacked back and now is going to have all this water shoot growth because let's say you actually have a tree that thinks it's 30 feet tall and you try to cut it back to 12 feet, it's going to push out the growth to go back to 30 feet. And if you look at the picture on the right, this is a tree that was severely hacked back and the water shoots are going right back up to the height they think the tree should be. So one of the things in pruning is to say, do I have a dwarf, a semi-dwarf, or a standard? How tall should this thing be? And how am I going to think through pruning it in a way that doesn't end up fighting with the tree? So the principles are, theoretically, citrus needs less pruning than other fruit trees. You top a new tree when you first plant it if they're too tall and spindly. You remove the water sprouts that you don't want, and you absolutely get rid of rootstock shoots. You prune in spring and early fall, but over pruning is not a good idea. It causes nothing but headaches. I'm not sure how well this comes across over Zoom. On the right, when you're starting with immature trees, you want to make sure that you have a leader, which is the main trunk, and you're enabling starting branching. If you do it incorrectly and you have multiple leaders, then your tree is going to grow up and not be as strong. And frankly, there won't be as much airspace inside the tree. So as you compare these three images on the left, what you want is several strong root trunk to branches, and then the growth out at the end of the branches, not a thicket of branches. So you pick your scaffolding branches in the first 2 to 3 years, you prune to those, and you create some spacing between them so there's air. And one of the best pieces of advice I got from a really good pruning person was, pardon me, you're better off doing a little pruning every month than trying to have a major pruning session once a year. So attention to the tree and small edits are better, believe it or not, because then the tree doesn't go nuts on you. In the orchard world, you will see these open trees, and they've been designed this way because they have better sunlight penetration, they're easier to harvest. The truth is they're not very structurally strong. And when you do this, they have a tendency to split in the middle. So if you're a homeowner, the open center is not the greatest idea. Rootstock pruning is, the picture on the middle here, you can see the graft where there's the rootstock and then there's scion up above it. That rootstock, if the tree starts to push out new growth in the rootstock, it will basically kill the tree above it and grow a new tree, and it won't be what you wanted. So make sure that you do not have suckers growing at the base like you see in the picture on the right.
So you used the word scion before as well when talking about the different varieties. Is that just the name for the specific variety?
Yes, the scion is, there's a set of rootstock varieties that, frankly, it seemed like a level of detail most of us don't care about. But what you're caring about is what's going to bear fruit. So if you want a blood orange, you want the blood orange that grows well in Marin County. The rootstock below that's purpose is to be disease resistant and to be an efficient purveyor of water and nutrients. So you want to make sure that the rootstock does not start to grow branches. The scion is what you want to grow branches and bear fruit. And that's been grafted onto the rootstock. Did that make sense?
Made sense to me. Thank you.
Okay. So thinning. So here's the. It's hard to visualize this, but since I've made this mistake, I'll just be honest with you. I bought a house. It had a very large lemon tree right against the house. I had no idea what I was doing, and I had heard that you could prune 35% of a tree per year, and it would be fine. So I took a 24-foot tall tree down to about 16 feet, and then was planning to go to 12. And all of a sudden, it just exploded with sort of thorny, nasty water shoots in all directions. And it's because I'd done this very hard pruning, and the tree just immediately put out new growth. So the other way to look at this is you never want to prune more than 20% a year. You should prune for shape and do it at the end of spring. Light thinning of the top of the trees promotes growth of new fruit wood. Don't leave the little stubs, that's not good. And periodic pruning and removal of branches can give you a lower spreading tree with an open interior that's easier to harvest. So I try to tell people, don't have a pruning weekend where you're going to kind of manically go through and prune the heck out of everything. Go out more often and do little things and keep an eye on the tree. You can prune in the spring once the frost danger is over, just before the start of the new growth cycle, or in the fall, winter. In fall, winter, pay attention if you're not pruning away fruit. Now, that was the pruning section. I urge everybody who's really interested in pruning, take a pruning class for Master Gardeners. They have wonderful pruning classes. It's an almost infinite subject by type of tree, by style, by size. But if you really want to get good at pruning, the thing to do is take some classes, because it takes some work to get good at. So container gardening. As I said earlier, you really want to have containers that are 15 to 25 gallons, 24 inches at the top, 24 inches deep is ideal, with good drainage. Now, clay pots are lovely, but if you're worried about evaporation, clay pots evaporate more. So there are some beautiful plastic containers that you would never know were plastic. But what they are better at is they'll retain water better. So when you go through the list of what grows well in the Bay Area and which ones do well in containers, it tends to be the fruit with smaller, the varieties with smaller fruit. So for example, kumquats, lemons, limes, sweet orange, and pomelo all have varieties that will do well in a container, or as an espalier. The rules are sort of the same. You need 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight per day, ideally unobstructed south-southwest facing. Container is twofold. One, you need to be thinking about year-round watering. And the truth is, the tree may have higher water demands because it's above ground than if it were in the ground. And the duration of watering should be shorter, because you're going to see water coming out the bottom of the pot if you let it run too long. And you do not want to have a dish that the pot sits in, because you don't want the citrus tree to get wet feet. In terms of soil, just use commercially available outdoor potting mixes. If you're seeing roots peeking out through the bottom about every 4 or 5 years, it's not a bad idea to repot your tree. And when you do that, you can lay it on the side, take the pot out, shake off the old soil, look for any old damaged roots, or basically where you're root bound, and trim off the excess roots. Put this plant back in the pot with new soil, and you should be able to grow a citrus tree in a pot for an awfully long time. Now, fertilizing a container, slow release fertilizers work very well. And then the alternative is to do monthly fertilizing spring to fall. You could do either approach. So that was basically the snapshot of container gardening for citrus trees. Here again, if you're really interested in container gardening, Master Gardeners has a bunch of classes on that, because in Marin County, about a third of our gardening world is in containers. And so there are all kinds of things to learn about container gardening. Any questions?
Are 30-gallon fabric pots okay for root pruning?
Oh, that's a big pot. Should be.
Okay.
Should be.
This may be a question more for the non-containers, as you haven't mentioned mulch for the containers, but in general, is there a particular type of mulch that you recommend?
Bark does well because it's relatively inexpensive, but there's all kinds of mulches out there, and I would go online and research them. For example, I know people in Mill Valley and Tam Junction, that area, where their citrus trees are in clay pots, and around the clay pots they have stone, and they have put stone on the top of the clay pots where the soil is, and as a mulch. And the reason is stone retains heat. So since they're in a cooler area, that is a form of mulch that actually keeps the plant warmer. So there are tricks you can play in mulching, but all trees need to be mulched.
That sounds like probably a good tip for those folks on the dock who get those cooler
Right.
winds. They get a lot of sun, that makes sense. We have a couple troubleshooting questions about pot container growing. First, a Meyer lemon tree that produces amazing lush flowers but no fruit in a pot. Do you have thoughts on what the problem might be?
It could be root bound. How long has it been in the pot? When was the last time you took it out and upgraded the soil and looked for root bound or damaged roots that you should cut off?
Okay. And an improved Meyer lemon tree in a container has yellowing leaves. Could it be a lack of nitrogen, or is there another cause that you might suspect?
I'm just about to go into that, but it's
Okay.
quite often yellowing means that they're not getting enough nutrients. So that's a fertilizing problem.
Okay. And then we're good for now. Thank you.
Thank you. So pay attention to your tree, and leaving the fruit on the tree is a good idea till you get to the end of the harvest window, in which case I pick a date and just clean the fruit off. If it's a year-round fruit, then you don't do that. But things like limes and grapefruits and oranges, you're going to want to, when you get to the end of the window of when it's harvest the last of the fruit, give it to your neighbors, and move on. So here's sort of in the problem-solving category. This tree on the left is my neighbor, Tony, lives a block from me. She called, she said, I've got this Meyer lemon. It's used to produce such amazing fruit, and look, it just looks terrible. So I went over and I asked her how long the tree had been there. And she said, well, it was a mature tree when we bought the house 35 years ago. So it's at least 50 years old. So we pruned it, we fed it, we deep watered it, and we couldn't turn it around. So when we finally took it out, the tree had about less than a ½ inch of wood around the bark. The center of the tree was completely rotted out. it was just incredibly old and dying. So this is an example of the tree had become too old. There are also trees that are just too big. And one of the maxims in Master Gardeners is right tree, right place. Well, in the citrus world, in Marin County, there are a lot of wrong trees in the wrong place. So you just have to decide, what are you going to do? Well, truthfully, and I know this sounds crazy, I've had people say to me, I have this wonderful citrus tree, I just don't like the fruit. Or it's too big, or it's too old, or frankly, the rootstock's taken over, or it's in the wrong place, it's too close to the house, it has bad drainage, or the location's too cold for this variety. I've even seen places where citrus trees are pushing up through the eaves of a house. So you really have to say, how much do I want to try and turn this thing around? Or should I remove an old tree and plant a variety I know I like in a better location? And this decision is just one you have to decide, sleep on, live with for a while, and then do. But an awful lot of the trees that were planted here in the 1950s or later were orchard specimen, standard sized trees planted too close to sidewalks, houses, fences, retaining walls, with inadequate sunlight, or the wrong variety. And life is short. Find the type of tree you want, take this out, put in a new one. Now, if you're putting in the same, like a Meyer lemon where there was a Meyer lemon, the trick to that is remove the old tree, try and get as much of the root system out as you can, then put gravel on top of that and put a container on top of that, and start the tree for the next 3 to 5 years in the container, and then in 5 years, then plant it in the ground. Because if you just immediately replace something with what was there before, you could have disease problems later. Now, frost protection. Some winters are more colder than others, and frankly, some parts of the county are way colder than others. So if you're on flat ground at the bottom of a hill or low ground, you could be 3 to 5 degrees colder than somebody a block away. So watch the temperature gauges and the temperature forecast. If you know you're going to have a night that's going to be 30 degrees or less for 30 minutes or longer, you've got a frost risk. So you can cover the trunk with thermal wrap or sheets. But if you're like me and you forget to do that, then when you get out the next morning and see that it had a frost, remove the frozen fruit. Do not immediately prune. Wait several months, maybe till spring, because you do not know how much real damage you have, and pruning early could exacerbate the damage, or you could cut away more than you needed to. Any questions before I move on to pest management?
I have a couple other kind of troubleshooting questions. Would you prefer I ask them now or save them?
No, now is fine.
Okay. So there's an orange tree that's planted in the ground that produces fruit, but the peel cracked before the fruit is ripe, or is ripe, sorry. Is the issue that it's not enough deep watering, or could there be another issue?
So there's fruit cracking?
Yeah, so the fruit grows, but the peel cracks before the fruit is ripe.
Well, what I would say is, here, Google IPM Davis, and this is the UC Davis Integrated Pest Management site, and click on the Home and Garden quadrant. And when you get there, pardon me, there's a whole section on citrus trees, and look for fruit cracking, because there could be different things going on.
Is my container lemon tree is growing straight up. How can I encourage it to spread out?
So you find the leader, the main trunk of the tree, top it, and you'll start to promote branching laterally out from it. as long as if most of the growth is going straight up, you're going to want to take, I don't know how tall this tree is, so how much you can de-leader it and then promote branch growth, you'll have to take a look at. I would Google this at pruning sites like Master Gardeners for how to promote branching, because you've got to look at the actual tree. If it's a brand new tree, that's different than a more established.
And I will say, if you have very specific questions, and you want to include all the details about your particular tree, the Marin Master Gardeners usually have a call-in hotline for assistance, which right now is not operational because there's no one in the office, but there is an email address, and I will include that email address in the follow-up.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that if you have specific problems like that, email them into our help desk. I'll give you the reference in a minute, and they can get back to you.
And do you have any thoughts about the product Cloud Cover?
I haven't used it, but I've been told it's good for frost nights.
Thank you. I think we're good for now.
Okay. So let's face it, we have rats, squirrels, who eat a lot of citrus and drive people crazy. So if you find evidence that your fruit is being eaten, go to our the UC IPM site, look up vertebrates, and it will give you a list of things you can do about this. It will involve probably trapping, but you should look it up. But when you're looking at fruit and flower problems, if you're getting few or no flowers, it could be because you over-pruned or the tree is too young. If you're seeing fruit drop, some is normal, but it could be some seasons we have a lack of pollination. If you have small fruit, you could have overplanted or have a rootstock sucker going on. If it lacks flavor, interestingly, I haven't been able to find as much research as I would like on how to improve flavor in citrus trees. We do know what not to do, which is do not overwater, because overwatering decreases flavor. I guess people are howling. It must be 8 o'clock. Oh, I have to wrap up. I'm sorry. If you're getting split fruit, that could be an irrigation problem or pot binding, possibly nutritional deficiency. There's a whole string of things related to yellow leaves and leaf drop. So here's where you get this. The reality is it's a mineral deficiency. So you'll want to look up in IPM, see something that looks exactly like what your leaves look like, and you might be doing foliar sprays in the late winter or adding zinc sulfate to water and watering with it. But there's a whole, it's interesting to me, there's a very long list of trace elements that citrus trees want, and they manifest themselves if they don't get them. No one's asked, and it's very unusual because usually people ask me about manure in this class. There are a lot of people who like to use manure, and you have to be aware that they can be very high in salt and can burn the trees. So if you are going to use manure, make sure you do it when it's going to rain or you can irrigate strongly. Manure that's not well composted can release ammonia that can actually injure the root system. So if you're going to use manure, make sure it's well composted, apply it in the fall right before heavy rain. That's the ideal time. This summer, you will see water stress. Smaller fruit, the leaves turn dull green, curl. If it gets too far along, the leaves will dry out and become crisp and start to drop. The solution is make sure that you're watering enough, and you might just have a year you have a very dry wind drying out the tree, in which case increase your irrigation. Now, we have a number of things that can be a problem. What to watch for versus things to address versus things that won't kill you but are irritating. The citrus psyllid is a little tiny, you can see the psyllid there in the picture. The problem is they carry a virus that kills the trees. So we've only seen one of these in Marin County to date, but they're happening in other parts of the country. So if you start to see what looks like on the new growth, little tiny critters growing on there, call the citrus psyllid hotline. The 800 number is right there. It's also on the Master Gardener site. Animalaria, you'll run into this if someone is in a new subdivision in an area that had oak trees. They cut down the oaks and left the root systems, and when they deteriorated, it leaves a virus in the soil. If this happens, it's very difficult to save the tree. You'll have to pull the tree and plant something else. Botrytis, the fruit looks bumpy. It's a fungal pathogen. It happens during cool and wet springs. And frankly, you left the fruit on the tree over the winter into the next season. So try and make sure that the tree's getting enough water and nutrition. Prune out the dead branches, remove damaged fruit. And when it dries up, these tend to go away. Scale. It can seriously damage a host. These are sucking insects that leave this hardened shell on the fruit. You can use ants to control it. You can use horticultural oil. Check with IPM before spraying. But scale you can have a bad season for it. And the citrus bud mite, this is where your fruit looks really weird. And they're very small. The easiest way to deal with it, as soon as you see fruit like this, get it off the tree and out of the yard. It won't kill the tree, but it can spread. So keep an eye on your fruit. If you start to see this, remove them immediately. So that was the presentation. I'm sorry I ran over. Are there any last questions?
I don't see anything. Oh, what are the lemons with the very thick skin, about 1/2 inch?
1/2 inch.
Is there a variety that you're familiar with?
Well, let's see.
Lemons. The person was told it was Meyer, but it wasn't.
No, if it's a Meyer, it has very thin skin. Did they say thick skin?
Yes, 1/2 inch.
That may be a Lisbon or a Eureka.
All right, good to know. Otherwise, we're mostly just getting a lot of thank yous and kind comments. We'll also, as I said, we'll send out a follow-up email. In that email, I'll give you ways to contact the Master Gardeners overall. And if you have any more questions for Joe specifically, you're welcome to send them my way and I'll pass them along. We have a question about doing a session on oaks. We can certainly look into it. And if you have any other specific topics that you would really like a whole training on, perhaps pruning, please do let me know, because we're scheduling these through the summer, it seems like. And even once we can have in-person sessions again, we love having the Marin Master Gardeners here. So any input on what you're particularly interested in? Also a question about doing a session on tomatoes. And I know that Joe actually did a session on tomatoes at the Larkspur Library just a few weeks ago. So if you go on YouTube.
Yes, that one is posted. So the
Yes.
Tomato Talk was 2 weeks ago, and it's on the Larkspur Library site.
So if you go to the Larkspur Library website, I can link to that in the training as in the follow-up email as well, just as, if you want more Joe. Additionally,
Nobody wants that. If you want to hear about planners, that's
if you're also getting questions as to whether you consult.
no. No.
Okay. I know though that the Marin Master Gardeners are a volunteer organization, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
And Fig Trees, as I said, we'll have a recording. Are you willing to share the slides specifically, Joe, or should
They're
they
in
be
the recording. You'll see all the slides are there, so you could stop them at any point if you want.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much, Joe, for the training. I personally learned a lot, as I always do with these trainings. And we really appreciate everyone coming along.
I'm so glad you all came, and please have a wonderful summer. Stay safe.